The Archetypal Tarot Podcast explores universal human patterns, called archetypes, by investigating the major arcana of the ancient tarot. We recognize these archetypes because they are present in our own life stories, myths, and culture. Each card represents a stage of the journey for understanding the greater story of our lives.
Hi, and welcome to the Archetypal Tarot Podcast. I'm Julienne Givot, a consultant specializing in working with archetypes, and with me, as ever, is tarot consultant Cyndera Quakenbush. Today we're discussing the card of the Emperor as a stage of a journey, along with the archetypes of the Father and the King. So thanks for tuning in, and first, let's talk about the images that appear on this card.
Great. So we have the Emperor, which is the card number 4, but it's the 5th card in our journey. But this number 4 seems to be very significant and tied to the King. And looking at the Emperor card of the Marseilles deck, the oldest tarot, he's got his legs crossed as he sits on his throne, and it looks like the number 4.
Totally.
And so we'll be exploring a little bit about why this 4 is important with what this king, what this emperor symbolizes for the journey of the Fool. But he's also pictured holding a scepter, of course. And he looks like a pretty, at least in this oldest image of the emperor, he looks pretty laid back and pretty approachable. He's this bearded man. He's holding kind of relaxed onto his belt, and he just looks like a very benevolent king. He's got one foot rested in the earth. He seems to be outside and looking into the distance, looking over a landscape perhaps, and possibly his kingdom, watching over. And then we also found some interesting symbols in some of the later decks. In the Rider-Waite deck, the Emperor is definitely a much more severe-looking individual. He's seated in a very old-looking stone solid throne. Once again, he's outside, but he seems to be facing more the audience or the viewer, whoever's viewing this card, and he's got this long beard. And the image that's different and that appears also in many other decks is the image of the ram, which connects him to Aries, to Mars, similar to reflecting back on the Empress, our last card. She was connected to Venus and Aphrodite. So here we've got the Emperor who is connected to the ram. And red seems to be a common color used. That's that color of Mars and of war. And that's about the imagery of the Emperor card for us here.
Yeah, there's, when I did some research on the different images of the cards, they tended to pretty much have, it was an older gentleman in a throne looking a little, and varying from looking kind of severe to just sort of grandfatherly. The image of the ram seemed to be pretty present, as well as, holding things, symbols in his hands. He's holding a sort of like a globe that's glowing in one hand and a scepter in the other. So there's, when I look at these cards, I think, here's somebody who has a lot of experience and authority. They know what they're doing. Careful crossing them.
They've been at this for a long time.
Yeah, experience.
Like. Yeah. He's comfortable in his throne, and he's been there for a while. So what does this card mean for the stage of the Fool? So he's just come from the Empress. He's had his ideas, the idea of his journey or the beginning of his journey nurtured by the Empress. And now he's coming across the Emperor and this sort of fatherly ruler authority figure. So we're going to explore a little bit about what this means for the Fool's journey.
Yeah. So coming from this, I immediately, when I see these cards, I think we went from the Empress, which is the mother queen, now are going to dad, basically. And I feel like your experience of life, of like, mom said no, I'm going to go ask dad, that kind of thing. And just the parity between the two. And so the first thing I look at in terms of a stage of a journey is you went from a place with the Empress Mother of just open creativity, and that just sort of like almost anything goes, loving creativity, just having a fertile ground for things to grow in and just try stuff out. The next stage you get to, he's a slightly more stern character, but where structuring starts to happen, where there's still nurturing, but the nurturing is in the form of paring things down a little bit, getting a little bit more realistic. Whereas with the mother, it was sort of like, yeah, go dream, do whatever you want, which is great. The next step is to go, okay, now how are you going to form this into something in the world?
That's right. And this is where that number 4 becomes significant, because if 4 is expressed as a shape, it's a square. And so the square has these sharp angles to it, and it's very, set. It has to have very equal measures on every side for it to be a perfect square. And so you're able to kind of square the circle here. You're able to cut off maybe some excesses and really pare it down to what it is you exactly want. It's a way of creating boundaries, a way of saying, this is my kingdom, this isn't my kingdom, and being very clear about things.
I think of it too as being like the difference between the left and the right brain, and when the way those operate. We went from the right creative, non-linear to the linear rational sort of stage of this. Both are needed, and I think in real life we'll probably have to balance back and forth between the two. But looking at this as a journey, it's this stage of finding out what needs to be pruned away, and what kind of structure is necessary to support your journey going forward. So what are the loving structures, or what are those sort of protective structures that can be put around it? I want to talk a little bit more about the father, because that's sort of, to me, like the first major archetype along with the king, but it makes sense for me to talk about the father first.
Let's do it.
So just as we had the mother and queen, you see the father and king, that the king's an outcropping of the father. I mean, the archetype of the father, along with the mother, are about as old as it gets. They're essentially our first archetypes. And I want to say too that just like with the mother archetype, seeing it as a symbol and seeing it as a structure, a set of behaviors and patterns, that it really does not have to do with our own personal experience with that archetype, with our fathers, or if we didn't have them or what have you, to look at this truly as a pattern, the way it is, and kind of distance yourself a little bit from your own experience.
That's right. And that this father or fathering can be a force that isn't necessarily only for a man, but that it can manifest and be present in the constellation of women as well. Sure.
And, really, honestly, the longer I do the kind of work that I do, the more important I see that that everyone take a look at how they parent themselves, how they work with these archetypes for themselves and then for other people. So it's just really important to kind of take a look at the father as being symbolic and as something that anybody can embody, no matter what their own personal experience with it has been. There's something about the father at this stage that, it's hard to come up with another word other than fatherly. Mm-hmm. There is that protective, caring, embracing, and yet very, very strong energy with the father. The father can be very organizing and practical, and it's that loving part that says, okay, it's time to stand up and let's give, there's room to practice. There's an encouragement to give something a try, but to also be practical about it. And the reason that you're practicing is for your pure experience of it. But how can you then take this out into the world? And that fatherly pride is a key component here of how can you look at whatever you're doing with that protective fatherly pride, which is different from the mother, and I think we all can kind of sense that.
Definitely. And so we have this interesting thing going on with the mother and the father, whereas if we experience nurturance and unconditional encouragement from the mother, say, we may get something similar from the Father equally loving, but it may be a toughening presence sometimes, like, dust yourself off if you fall down and just get up and try it again sort of thing. That's maybe a little more, I don't know, direct, and
it's reassuring. Yeah, it's reassuring in a different way.
Yeah, like you can do it. Come on, get up on your feet there.
Yeah, there's a confidence building. It's just it's a different form, and it has a lot to do with making sure that the right foundations are in place. And those foundations, sometimes they're very masculine. It's the masculine side of love and patience and stability and kind of working on getting things right, instead of sort of rushing off to go do whatever or dropping the project. It could be in its highest aspect about a positive discipline, and discipline not as a punishment, but as a you're worth it. Keep giving this a try. Don't give up.
Carve out the time. Have a schedule.
Right, exactly. And so the highest part of the most empowered part of the father archetype is very much being a provider. So how do you provide for this dream that you've got, or this calling that you're following? So you are the provider. How do you provide for it? Do you give it enough time? Are you too busy running around doing other things, or you're not giving it attention? Do you create a structure for it and protection, where you pay attention to it in a way that maybe this isn't a good time to bring this idea to that friend who's really critical, or to bring it out into the world quite yet. That's that fatherly wisdom of to know when is it time to sort of push the kid out of the nest and know that it's ready.
Because our emperor is watching the walls of the kingdom. He sees, he lays out that boundary and is able to say, okay, this is my kingdom and I'm watching over it. Allow the work to begin. Allow this process to happen within these walls.
All with the energy or the environment of being an experienced person. So if you think of the father archetype as having experience and being sort of a creator of things, but also kind of knowing how things work. The dad's like, oh, well, I know how that works, and I'll help you figure out how to put that together. It's that kind of energy. It's that sort of guiding wisdom that in its highest aspect can shield a person, but also provide a lot of common sense. That's, I think, the most beautiful part of that sort of like loving, all right, come on back here, let's show you how to do this. It's that strong masculine sense that's guiding and loving, has a lot of wisdom and experience that's totally available to anybody, whether they're a man or a woman. It's a neat archetype.
So let's now discuss what some of the shadow aspects may be of this father archetype.
Yeah, well, just as with any archetype, when its powers are really, really great, they can also be really, really injuring and bad, evil, if you will. So let's just go with the shadow parts of the father. Impatient and demanding, really controlling way of being. So let's look at this in terms of a project. If someone's writing a book, you get really impatient and demand from yourself that you get it done, and kind of become a tyrant to yourself, that it's right the first time, and that you'll never be enough. Things like that. That's a really shadow way of going about things. That, quite frankly, I think doesn't work very well at all, but it is something that we see in our culture, and we might have experienced that in our families, where you have one parent or another acting as that father that's like, you'll never be good enough. That's really damaging, I think, to a lot of people, and that the heart of this archetype is to be encouraging with that kind of loving structure. But when it shows up in the shadow, boy, it can be dispiriting and horrible. There's something, too, about, and we could say this for the mother as well, but in my research, I saw it a lot in culture and books, showing up as the father, of having that unlived life projected onto their child. Or in this case, symbolically, basically putting your whole life's worth into your project. And so here's my unlived life. So if it was a child, you'd be like, you're going to do better than me. You know what I mean? There's that dynamic, you better do better better than me, but if you do, I'm going to resent you for it. I mean, that's a really tricky place to be. And that's deeply a part of the shadow of the father. And we see that show up in culture. Also, too, some of the shadow aspects of the father, to be cold and disconnected, to neglect the family, to neglect the children, or symbolically to start to neglect the project when they're upset with it. Like, you know, you're working on a project and you're just, I don't like the way it's going. And so you neglect it, you put it away. You abandon it in so many ways. The shadow can also, and the father can create an unhealthy competition between people and between their child, or they can become unable or feel that they're unable or afraid to protect something. So the father can be like, I don't think I can, I'm just going to run away because I don't know how to protect the family. And, you know, you see that in books and cultures where the father's not actually present as a character, but they're present by their absence. So the whole book is about the father who wasn't there. And so that's another shadow aspect of the father. So yeah, it can be ew.
And I'm thinking now about how much is projected onto how that father archetype is such a projection that can be put onto people. And when someone is figured out to be a human being, I'm thinking particularly right now of Freud and the experience he had with his own father, that his father turning out to disappoint him so much and be so human can, like, wow, I thought you were everything. I thought you were sitting on the throne of my family, and that to realize that the father is this human being, the father archetype misplaced or deplaced in that way, that can be a pretty painful experience as well.
Sure, and I think the valuable thing after, and that'll probably happen to everybody with their parents, because that's just the experience of being, you know, an infant and needing everything to be provided from other people. And whether they're your parents or other people around, you will see them as godlike, or you will see them as these all-powerful beings. And there will be a certain point where you realize, oh, well, they're not. And that hopefully will happen at a stage where one can take these archetypes and pull them back into themselves.
Yeah, that's
or at
right.
least begin to see, oh, okay, that person, they need to parent themselves as well.
Right.
And that's something I can also do for myself to kind of pull those projections back. But
oh yeah, and this is such a common thing in relationships, right? When we meet that potential significant other projecting maybe these very strong, masculine, saving, rescuing qualities, the rescuer being another archetype, onto that human being.
Sure.
And having to figure that out. Yeah.
Sure. And that's rough. I mean, you see that a lot with the knight and the damsel, and just the looking for what they feel is absent in themselves to have that happen, have that appear for them in the other person. That's a big part of relationship struggles, and many great books have been written about those struggles. My favorite, if any of the readers are interested, Robert Johnson, who's a Jungian psychologist, he's written some great books that, gosh, I think he wrote them in the 70s, but they really stand up today. There's a book called We, W-E. Brilliant book, easy to read, or pretty easy to read.
Yeah, definitely, and it includes mythology, and it's a wonderful breakdown.
Yeah, if you're getting a kick out of these podcasts and you're interested in sort of the psychology of archetypes and projection, We is a great book. He also wrote one called He, about the masculine psyche, and one called She, about the feminine. So those are good ones to check out.
Easy titles to remember as well. Robert Johnson.
And the bookstore on my site has. You can order them from there.
So, excellent.
I know, right? I'm all prepared. We hope you're enjoying this episode, and we invite you to become a part of the Archetypal Tarot team by becoming a patron. It's super easy, and there are some awesome rewards for joining. So just visit tiny.cc/tarot for more information. And now back to our program.
And so what are some films with the father archetype that are present?
Ah, yes. Myth, culture, and movies. You know what I was thinking about the dad? Kind of my favorite TV dad is Bill Cosby in The Cosby Show. Gotta love him. Both the mother and father archetypes are portrayed, I think, really, really well there. You don't really see a lot of the shadow, but then, it's TV. And then my all-time favorite movie dad, and this is true for, I think, a lot of people, is Gregory Peck in Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm-hmm. Atticus Finch. It's just got to be the most ideal father figure archetype in film. It's amazing.
And he still shows up as being pretty human. You see the struggles that he has.
Mm-hmm.
And just to think that film was made in 1962, long before either of us were born. And I think what people today, it's still very viable. And it is kind of the TV dad that people will think of, or the movie dad that people think of. And kind of intertwined with that, I'm going to roll in the Frances McDormand's character as the mother in Almost Famous. So she's a mom, and she's a single mom, but there's a scene where she takes her young son, I think he's like 12 or 13, To Kill a Mockingbird. And they're walking away from the movie theater, and she's having a discussion with him. And essentially she is teaching him about the archetype of the father from watching that film. And you also see her having to portray or having to call in and enact the archetype of the father herself, because she's a single mom. And so it's a great example of a woman who has to, she's had to play both roles. And throughout the film, you do see her very much being the mom, and you also see her needing to be the dad, and that struggle, that internal struggle that she has to try to embody both and going back and forth.
And what a great example of that fathering force being able to be present in anyone like that. That's great.
Absolutely.
So why don't we talk now a bit about the shadow aspect father in film?
Sure. And I will note, too, that if anybody wants to read more about some of the archetypes, if you go to my website, there's going to be a link for the podcast section. I'm going to do a list of the various films and things that have, like, say, the father and the king archetypes.
Great idea. It's
so easy to come up with so many of them. And
there's a lot for this
half
archetype.
This podcast could be me talking about the movies. So, oh God, the shadow aspect of the dad. Oh, okay. There were a lot of them, but the ones that I'm going to mention, I think, they're realistic. There was like the guy in the movie The Shining, who was a father, but like that didn't really apply as much. So to kind of go somewhat realistic, there's a pretty popular show called Mad Men, and the main character is Don Draper, played by John Hamm. And he's a dad, he has 2 kids, but he's that, like, neglectful, too wrapped up in his own problems. He tends to, they're divorced and he only has the kids for the weekend, and he spends half the time going out on dates and leaving them with the sitter. So there's that sort of shadow, neglectful, he kind of yells at the kids when he's cranky. So he's disconnected. And that really shows that, like, he's got all the power, but he's not really doing much. And you see a lot of his guilt, too, in between times. So I wanted to mention that. Kevin Spacey's role in American Beauty. I mean, archetypally, he's kind of all over the place, but there's that section of starting to get completely selfish and jealous of your children. And that shows up in American Beauty. Let's see. John Lithgow showed up as the bad dad a couple times. And I think of him from, like, Harry and the Hendersons or whatever being, like, super dad. But I'd forgotten. Footloose. He was that minister and the father who was just very strict and controlling. And then he played a horrific character in, I think, like the 4th season of that show, Dexter, on Showtime. Oof. If you really want to see the best and the worst of the father, John Lithgow's character in that is definitely there for that. And he's like the double-sided. You either see the light father or the shadow father. It's crazy. And I also wanted to mention, Cyndera and I, you and I had been talking about the archetype of the father, say, in the last 20 years in popular culture, where the dads are these portrayed as like the bumbling fool.
Yeah, and it's totally become apparent. You can see it in TV commercials, a lot of television shows, sitcoms or cartoons, perhaps like The Simpsons or Family Guy, that you have this laughable father. And I find that a very interesting, perhaps even an American phenomenon in particular, maybe perhaps extending beyond that, but...
at least in the English-speaking countries, you see it in England, Canada, and Australia as well.
And I remember hearing something James Hillman said in a I was listening in on a recording of his all men's event, which was really quite interesting, and he was saying quite how troubling this phenomena was, that the father's just sort of been deplaced in this way, or maybe there's good and bad sides to this, but that it can be a troubling thing, I think, for the family as a unit, and as for the confidence of the father himself and his ability to take care of his family.
Yeah, and based on the conversation, I was like, you know what? That's really, it's all over the place. The show 2.5 Men, John Cryer's character. I mean, Mrs. Doubtfire, that film. Homer Simpson. You mentioned Al Bundy of Married with Children, The Family Guy. You're not gonna run out of examples of this. And my quick thought on it is the father in these shows he's characterized as the father, but barely shows up in that actual archetypal role. And that's I think speaks more of sort of the where people are in the cultures, because they've lost touch with what this archetype really is. People who are my guess, and this is totally Julienne's guess, but my guess is the people doing the writing of the shows, maybe they personally didn't experience that Atticus Finch type dad, or that truly close to the archetype role, or they had such a negative experience where they ended up with the John Hamm character, that neglectful dad, that they don't know what it is. They're not getting the full role, and their reaction to it is to write them as these ineffectual, men, or selfish men, or idiots.
And it resonates with people because it mirrors maybe, or fills in something in their life.
It's such a narrow view, and oftentimes it's just really, really inaccurate. Where they're in the dad role, but they're really much more of the fool, or the hedonist, or the shadow characteristics of the victim, or something.
Interesting.
So there's that.
So now, expanding this view of the father, growing this archetype to expand to the kingdom, we now have the king archetype, which relates to this emperor sitting on his throne.
So yeah, I mean, if you see the father as his realm being the family, and taking care of the family, and whatever that comprises, whether it's their community or their children, their literal family, it's that bigger step out. It's being responsible and having that masculine authority, and that creating structures for a larger and larger world, be it the company that they work for, or the group that they're in charge of. This is very, the king is very much about authority and having responsibility, being benevolent, being an organizer, and very much serving the larger group. I think it's a good place to kind of go from the caretaking of the father for the idea, the project, to then seeing, how does this reflect out into the world? How is it, whatever you're doing, what are the structures can you put in place right now that will enable you to share it and give that gift to the a larger space, a larger realm.
That's right. And in his light attributes, and looking at the emperor, returning back to his scepter, in many of the interpretations, we have a feminine symbol with the cross, a more masculine symbol. And so he's a king who's in touch with his feminine side, who's able to rule with kindness and compassion, as well as having a firm hand and a firm grip on his kingdom.
I think that's just saying that that it's not mutually exclusive, that love is not feminine and it's not just masculine. It will have its types of forms showing up. And so to see this as the Fool coming along and a stage and having that fatherly protection, and that nurturing and the structure and ensuring that the foundations are safe. The king is, I see anyway, being responsible and seeing how this foundation is going to support more people. The family gets bigger, the world at large, the empire, it is the emperor. It also says to me that there's a bit of an ego check moment happening with this stage, and about being generous. There is something that can happen with a king where that's like you get too big for your realm, where it could potentially become all about you and these grandiose ideas. So I see it as a moment to be like, okay, ego check. Like, what is this project that I'm doing really able to be of service to a larger group. So that's something that came up in researching it, and also looking at with the king, how the king can go bad.
Yeah, and so that kind of brings us to the shadow realm, and it also reminds me of just old pagan practices in which the king or ruler was, once he reached maturity or was on the top of his throne, this king was killed, and that was viewed as like the way to return him to, and a sacrifice to allow the earth to continue to be fertile. And there's this theme throughout Greek mythology of maybe the young hero, he conquers things, he accomplishes his goal, he cuts out his kingdom or conquers a kingdom, but then he becomes the authority which he sought to overthrow. And so that is the danger, once again, that we have with the king or the emperor. Is he getting too solid in that throne and too tyrannical? Too much power. That's exactly it. And so if the light aspects of the king are, magnanimous and strong and responsible and benevolent, being an organizer, the shadow aspects are cruelty, again, being disconnected from your people, disconnected with the needs of what the people you're serving, being a tyrant, a dictator, and feeling really entitled and self-serving. And that is a big part of that sort of disconnection that can show up. You've got so much authority, and I think, obviously, historically, we see kings a lot of them were about, how can I get my kingdom bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was all about the empire versus how happy is my kingdom, how fruitful is it, how, science and the various arts and things that were happening, supporting that kind of growth versus anything to go and get the grail or anything to go and get this and that. And it didn't matter how many people had to die or who had to suffer to create that expansion of the empire. So that's something that's kind of the ego check moment, I think, for this stage of the journey, is to kind of go, oh, okay, all right, kind of come back to the father who goes, all right, what's practical here, and you need to get up and go, but be careful that you don't lose sight of what it is, what your real intention is. That's right. And are you able to support and hear out arguments that are the antithesis of your kingly statement? I think that's really important too. It's like, are you able to support the Occupy movement? Are you able to hold that in your kingdom as well as being able to keep your order and so forth? Are you able to allow a freedom of ideas to flow? And that may be important for the fool as well, who's got, I want to do this thing with my life, or I've got this vision. What is the antithesis of your vision? And are you able to hold that as a possibility as well? Yeah, that's really, really big. And as if you see the path from the father to the king is one of being, it's expanding. And that there's hold-ons available where the next stage of growth always requires you to hold everything that you just experienced and bring it with you. The atoms to molecules, all of that. That's a fractal symbol that I think shows up throughout this journey of these tarot cards, and I think anyway in our lives, it is about a larger and larger space and the understanding of where you came from. And I think that goes nicely into maybe the films that the king shows up in. And you mentioned earlier the King's Speech in that film. Yeah. Colin Firth. I at first thought, well, he's very much the prince, and there is, although not always, there is a prince to king path. But they can be standalone archetypes. So you see him learning to speak and have his voice, and the thing in the film for him, which was very much about the king and not about the prince. His brother was the prince who wanted to go play. He had to step up to that role, even though he was terrified to do it. Yeah, that's right. And what a wonderful example or symbol for all of us that if we're needing to engender an archetype, if we're needing to grow it in our lives, that we can go through that. We can work on ourselves to allow that, welcome that archetype in, even if we don't feel that we're naturally like that, or we feel too human because of whatever impediment that we feel we might have, that with work on ourselves and by really allowing that archetype to come into our lives, it can happen. And so he became a very positive king.
He became the king, although there is definitely those moments you can see in his sort of trajectory where he was really hesitant to do that. But his caring for his people is what brought him through, and his wife and the man who's the speech therapist. Other kings, Commander Adama, played by Edward James Olmos in Battlestar Galactica. Both king and father, you can see those two roles happening. Sometimes you just can't stand them, but that's when he's choosing to be a king over a father. Just like we talked about Aaron Brockovich, there is that moment that you have to choose for the greater good than your family, and that's the mark. That's the mark of a king. Sean Connery, just as an actor. I mean, I don't know how many films he's played a king, but, it's the First Knight, the man who would be king, Time Bandits. I mean, he just himself really embodies that archetype.
Indiana Jones's father.
And he's the father in Indiana Jones. Yeah. It was great. One I'll point out that is probably the least obvious, but really interesting, was a film called Whale Rider. I think it was 2002. There is the girl, the protagonist in that film, played by Keisha Castle Hughes. Her role, throughout the film, was king versus king. Her grandfather was the king, and she was this young king. And so if you're interested in seeing like a non-literal great version of mostly the positive aspects of the king, watch Whale Rider. Also another one of my favorite films.
I love that film.
And to get into the Shadow Kings, oh my God, it's too easy. The big ones, The Godfather. All the Godfather films, you see both the father and the king. You see Marlon Brando, and then you see the sort of prince to tyrant thing happening with his sons. Brutal, but a really good example of how a good archetype can go bad. The same thing for The Sopranos. Very similar dynamics happening there. And then, of course, Darth Vader. Sorry, we're getting silly here. But Darth Vader, just, evil king. He's a tyrant. He lost touch, or at least for much of the films, had lost touch with his own ability to father. And
also recognizing that film, Star Wars, was totally built and written off of
the hero's journey.
The hero's journey, the understanding of these archetypes. Yeah. So, it's just classic, right?
You really could say that the movie is a lot about the family, too, and understanding the relationship of fathering and self-fathering. Another one really quick is the last Lord of the Rings film, Return of the King, the Faramir and Lord Denethor. Horrible. This is like the bad dad times 10, where it's something to understand that there's this dynamic relationship between the father and the king that, they challenge their son to do better than them, and then when they start to do it, they just want to crush them. And so that's something that's a dynamic that you see really, really strongly in that film. And, but it's not all bad. It's just one of those things with an archetype that you can spot the pattern, you can see it happening, and it represents a set of potential choices that people have.
All right, so that's what we have for you today for the Emperor archetype, or the Emperor tarot card with the archetypes of the King and the Father. And so just on your own, if you're thinking of any sort of creative project right now or some new step in your life, just these two cards of the tarot, the Empress and the Emperor, can be wonderful guides for you in nurturing your project and allowing it space to grow, and then bringing in that Emperor archetype to organize and to provide a boundary in which you can get this work done and create a schedule for yourself. And so have fun exploring with those as we have, and we will see you in the next tarot podcast exploring the Hierophant.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. And again, if anybody has any questions or comments, you can leave us a review on iTunes or on our podcast website, or you can just send us an email to atpodcast@archetypist.com. Thanks, and I hope you tune in next time. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to become a part of the Archetypal Tarot team by becoming one of our patrons. Our patrons are awesome. So if you're interested, visit tiny.cc/tarot for more information and the awesome rewards for joining. That's tiny.cc/tarot. Thank you for joining us for the Archetypal Tarot Podcast. For more information on Cyndera's work, please visit her website, tarotdreamstone.com. For more information on Archetype Consulting, visit archetypist.com. That's archetypist.com. Thanks for listening.